Welcome, everybody. My name is Stephen White. I'm the Executive Director of the Catholic Project here at the Catholic University of America, and it's my pleasure to welcome you, those of you who are here with us on campus and those of you who are tuning in via live stream. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the Catholic University of America for this evening's discussion entitled Shepherds to a Wounded Flock, How Our Priests See the Crisis. I want to begin, before I thank and introduce our panelists, I want to begin by thanking my assistant, Sarah Finnegan, who's here, and Carla Zoya for their help in putting this together, along with all the event staff here at CUA working behind the scenes. A brief word about the Catholic Project. For those of you who don't know, the Catholic Project is an initiative of Catholic University begun by President Garvey, who's here with us. And the idea is to enlist the university in the work of doing what can be done to help the church find her way out of this crisis that we're in. We believe that Catholic University has both a responsibility and a unique capacity to serve the church in this regard. One of the many ways we are doing this is through hosting these sorts of public events like the one this evening. We have heard over the recent months from survivors of clerical sexual abuse and from bishops. We have heard from theologians and historians, sociologists and journalists. We have listened to laymen and women speaking about what is broken in our church and how to best address the tremendous challenges we all face. This evening, we turn our attention to men who have experienced the pain of this past year in a particular way, our priests. These men have felt the same anger and betrayal in recent months as the rest of us, but they have also borne, to one degree or another, the weight of the sins of their own brothers. For all that, they are still called to be shepherds to a wounded flock, a flock that includes many who have now learned, unfortunately, to distrust their own shepherds. I invited these men because I have heard from many priests and bishops around the country that over the last year, things have become more difficult. Relationships have been strained in a way that is new. I don't mean this in a woe is me, our priests are the real victims here sort of way, of course. And these men are not here because we want to proclaim that Father knows best. I would maybe make an exception for in my own house with my own children, but these men are here because the relationship between the clergy and the laity is not meant to be one of antagonism or a zero-sum game. It is meant to be one of collaboration and mutual reinforcement. Some priests and bishops have violated that relationship in horrific ways. It is the particular nature of this crisis, of this iteration of the crisis, that credibility and trust between the laity and clergy has been strained and eroded. But hopefully, this discussion, in addition to being enlightening and thought-provoking, can also be, for those who need it especially, a balm for wounded hearts and a sign of hope in discouraging times. A brief word about how this evening will proceed. I will introduce each of our panelists in turn, and having done that, I will ask them some questions about how they have experienced in particular ways this last year. What kinds of things have they seen on the ground and in their ministries that might not be obvious to the rest of us? I'll then proceed to open to a conversation between the four of them, and we'll see where that goes. About 20 or 30 minutes on, and that will be at my discretion, I want to turn to a slightly different theme of how our panelists see this crisis in terms of broader trends and challenges that the church is facing. Not just the immediate challenge of the crisis of sexual abuse in the church or the dealing with that crisis, but how these recent months have changed, if they have changed, how these men see their ministry and the long-term future of the church in the United States. After that, so roughly an hour in, we will open up the floor to questions. And by then, we should be able to wrap up, and it will only be about the third inning. We will certainly be done by 9 o'clock. So without further ado, our panelists. I will start at the far end. Father Paul Scalia is vicar for clergy in the Diocese of Arlington. He has spent more than 20 years in various parishes in that diocese, and just this summer was named pastor of St. James Parish in Falls Church, Virginia. He is the author of That Nothing May Be Lost and editor of Sermons in Times of Crisis. I have to confess I was slightly disappointed. I saw the title of the second book and went and looked it up online and realized that none of the sermons are actually by you. They're all by people like Augustine of Hippo and Leo the Great. But I suppose it's still worth checking out. Father Carter Griffin, to Father Scalia's right, is a priest of the Archdiocese of Washington and rector of St. John Paul II Seminary, just up the road here in Washington. He served as a naval officer before entering the seminary and was ordained in 2004. He is the author of Why Celibacy, which I've been reading, Reclaiming the Fatherhood of the Priest, which was published earlier this year, a timely topic and one that we will probably touch on at least briefly tonight. Father Matthew Fish is the administrator of Holy Family Catholic Church and School in Hillcrest Heights, Maryland. Originally from Washington State, he did his undergraduate studies at the Franciscan University of Steubenville in Ohio. He holds graduate degrees in philosophy and theology from here at the Catholic University of America. I first met him when we were both students in the School of Philosophy here. And he also studied at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome. He was ordained in 2015. Is that correct? Okay. Father Robert Boxey was born and raised in southwest Louisiana. He is a priest of the Archdiocese of Washington. He was ordained in 2016, correct? He completed his seminary studies at Theological College at CUA and at the North American College in Rome. He didn't include this in the bio that he sent to me, but I happen to know that he earned a law degree from Harvard as well in his spare time, presumably. He's currently the parochial vicar at St. Joseph Catholic Church in Largo, Maryland. So please join me in welcoming our four panelists. Let me begin where the introductions ended with Father Boxey, and I will pose the question that I'll be posing to all of you. What stands out from your experience of the last year? How have you experienced these last 12 or 18 months in a way that has affected you and your ministry, but especially in ways that might not be immediately evident to those of us in the pews, those of us who aren't priests?
Thank you, Stephen, for the question and also for the invitation to be here. This has been a tough year for all of us. And I think also definitely as priests, dealing with the news and especially our brother priests, those who have fallen under the weight of their ministry or challenges that they've been facing. But for me, and I can be very honest with you in this, my ministry from the beginning was always to be a faithful disciple and a faithful priest of Jesus Christ. And that's what I signed up for. That's what I made promises to the bishop that ordained me, in seminary formation. And so that's what it's been for me from the very beginning, to be this instrument of God's love, God's mercy, God's hope, and God's nearness to the people that I serve. I think I'm also a little bit lucky in terms of my parish assignment with the great people at St. Joseph Catholic Church in Largo. A very spirited, faithful people that has been hurting and wounded by what's been going on this past year and a half. But they've been very receptive and open to receiving me and my ministry. And I think that the thing, at least perhaps from my point of view, that I've been trying to bring to them is to really try to establish as best as I possibly can the trust that has been lost among a lot of our people, a lot of the laity, a lot of the faithful. But then this has always been a part of even before the scandal broke, right after I was ordained, to really get to know the people that God has entrusted to my care, to build relationships, to allow them to get to know me, and for me to get to know them as best as I possibly can. And I think those relationships are vitally important for priests right now. Healthy relationships with the laity, with the faithful, with the people that we serve, that will hope to restore the trust in the church, in our institutions, and especially in the priests that certainly has been tarnished over the past year and a half.
Father Fish, I'll ask you the same question about the last year and what jumps out to you as noteworthy and how you've experienced these recent months and what might be surprising to folks who aren't in your shoes. With this edition, and we'll keep this going, how do you restore trust that's been broken by somebody else?
For me, this last year has been a revelation of brokenness and disappointment that I had not thought possible before. Brokenness and disappointment in the church. And so much of my vocation as a priest, where that came from, was a real love of the church and experience of many priests and Catholics whom I looked up to, inspired me, and just gave me this awareness of how blessed I was to be a Catholic and wanting to give back to that. One of the high school, actually, that I went to in Washington State, Bellarmine Prep, I started going to daily mass my junior year in high school, which is a big part of my vocation story. And I found out years later that the Jesuit priest who said most of the daily masses in the small Jesuit chapel, was about 12 of us students and some other teachers and adults who went. Father Jim Poole, who was the worst of the priest abusers up in Alaska for something like 4 decades, which even before this last year was, when I learned about this just a few years ago, was a real experience of disappointment, thinking about how for all those years, this priest was there ministering to us young kids, and something could have happened. I don't think anything did, but that authorities knew about this, knew about his past, and put him in a situation with young kids where their lives could have been wrecked forever. This was brought back to me this last year, thinking about so many people that I heard about, read about, who had not just their innocence, but I think in a lot of ways, their faith taken from them, and feeling that disappointment, that brokenness deeply. But in the midst of that, this last year, you fall that, for a certain length of time, and you get frustrated, and you get angry, and you want to hold leaders accountable, but you can only take that frustration and that feeling so far. And I think for a lot of priests, and for me certainly, at a certain juncture, there came this need to encounter Christ in a deeper level in the midst of that brokenness and disappointment. And in a beautiful way, for me, and this kind of gets to that second part of your question. And I'm, like Father Boxley, I'm blessed to be at a African-American parish southeast of the city. And in my parish, I preached on it a number of times, and people talked to me about it, shared their frustration, their disappointment. But talking to some other pastors of Black churches in our region, it was experienced a little differently in the Black community. And I saw this in my parish, that my community talked to me about how they've known a lot of disappointment and brokenness for some time. And seeing the hope that they had in the midst of a struggle that has gone on for much of their lives. They really taught me something that I was not expecting, and taught me how to encounter Christ in the midst of that struggle and that brokenness in a way that I just had not had before. So even though it was a really frustrating year in a lot of ways, by the grace of God, it became a blessing insofar as it was an encounter of Christ in this new way, in this brokenness and disappointment through hope.
Father Griffin, same question to you with this wrinkle. Unlike the other three men up here, you work with seminarians. You're rector of a seminary, and I imagine there's a unique dynamic that comes with having been there over these recent months.
Sure. Thank you, Stephen, and thanks again for the invitation to be here. Like these other men, like all of us, we've had an incredibly hard year and a half, and if that's true for us, it's in some ways, I think, exacerbated in the life of a young seminarian, who is discerning a vocation in which he's going to be giving his life over to the people of God, but expressed really through obedience to bishops and to pastors and to others in the church. And so if this has been a sort of a crisis of confidence, a crisis of trust for all of us, I think it's sort of redoubled in the life of a young man who is discerning the priesthood. And so, that it has been, and particularly being here in Washington, I think that emphasizes it even more. I think what this year and a half has meant for me, and I think for them as well, is it has been an encouragement to a deeper and more maybe supernatural view of the church. I'm a convert myself. I came into the church when I was in college, and I remember friends of mine, Protestant friends of mine, asking how I could become Catholic given the history of the Catholic Church. You say, how could you become a member of something that has the Inquisition and the Borgia popes and and all these things? And that was never a challenge for me. The Immaculate Conception was a challenge for me. there were challenges, but that was never one. It was the sense that, it's the church is made up of sinful human beings. And in fact, if anything, the fact that Jesus continues to work through the church with so many fallen pastors, so many weak and sinful pastors, as he did through one of the 12, right? And at the very beginning of the church's existence, to me was always a sign of the divine institution of the church and the divine governance of the church by the Holy Spirit. What this year has meant for me, I think, is that has become not just an article of faith, but it's had to become a very personal, subjective article of faith. I've had to actually renew that and deepen my own faith that, in fact, the church, despite all of us sinful human beings, is in fact guided by the Holy Spirit, that she's founded by church, and she is his spotless and immaculate bride. And I believe that very firmly. I believe that in some ways stronger today, because I have to believe it stronger today if one is going to remain Catholic. And I do, and I believe it with all my heart. And trying to convey that to the seminarians has certainly been a challenge. But it's been also a kind of beautiful challenge, because it has really forced me to maybe reveal my own faith, including my own frustrations and my own anger at what's been going on, but also my deep sense of hope, as Father Fish was just saying, Father Boxey, my deep sense of hope that the Lord is still in charge. So I think that's been a very immediate and very personal thing for me.
Father Scalia, again, same question to you, but with this wrinkle, you, in addition to being a pastor of a large parish, are the vicar for clergy in a diocese. So the problems with other priests affect you in a particular way. Tell us about the last year with that wrinkle.
I was struck first what you said, phrase that you used in your introduction, when you referred to the scandal, then you said rather this iteration, which, this is sort of, the church is always needing to be purified, and this is sort of kind of another iteration of ongoing struggle against scandal. I was a young priest in 2002, And so I remember when all of that rolled out, and this was just so markedly different from that. But both, I think, in the response of the faithful, and certainly in my own position. When the Pennsylvania grand jury report came out, because of my job at the Diocese as Vicar for Clergy, we had to go through the report and see if any of the priests named in there had served in Arlington. And so that's not happy reading, that report. And so I remember at the going back to my residence at the end of the day and just trying to relax. And where I lived then had an adoration chapel right around the corner. And so I thought, well, this is probably a pretty good time to go to the door of the Lord. And so I reached for my collar to put my collar back on. And it's the first time in my priesthood that I actually hesitated, because I'd be, walking along the street and I did put the collar on. But I remember it struck me that was the first time in my priesthood I've ever hesitated to go out in public with the Roman collar on. And then, just speaking to the priests about it and getting their feedback, the shame that was felt by what our brother priests had done, the anger of what was not done, and then the fear. Another thing that comes up is a fear of false accusations and a fear of not being supported. So those were all, I think, came in very powerfully, and I think in comparison to 2002, those were new things. And but I think a lot of priests also in the past year, I think, have been thrown back to fundamentals and have realized, well, gosh, I have to go deeper into my priesthood then. And I know that there's been a kind of a recommitment to guys getting together and encouraging one another in that and going deeper into the priestly identity. And because I think another thing that came out in all of this was the ancillary sort of things, or the other symptoms of the crisis, that it was not just a sexual abuse crisis, but I think a lavish lifestyle on the part of some clerics was revealed, and I think that was a source of scandal as well. A degree of disobedience on the part of some, and that shouldn't be surprising, because chastity, poverty, and obedience always go together, and so do their opposites. So I think that guys looked at that and said, well, we need to go deeper into these things, and so that was an edifying response. And I don't remember seeing that in 2002. In 2002, I think there was just sort of anger. But this time around, brother priests were more intent on sort of saying, okay, what's our response going to be? And the response has to be, well, we have to be better priests. You ask the question, how do you restore trust broken by someone else? I don't think you can. I think you can simply just, suffer with the people and just try to be faithful yourself. I'll end on this sort of happy note. The day after the Pennsylvania grand jury report, a man came to meet with me about entering the Catholic Church. And I was kind of intrigued that, of all days, I would be talking to somebody who wanted to enter the church. And I asked him why. He said, well, because the Catholic Church is the only body that has the institutional integrity to withstand the problems of the modern world. And I looked at him in silence for what felt like 5 minutes. And I said, well, do you read the newspaper? And he smiled and he said, Father, I know all about that, and it's horrifying. But Father, it's a moral problem, and he said, one generation of holy priests will rid us of it. And I thought, well, that's all it takes, just one generation of holy priests. But that was such a kind of it was a wonderful response for him to say that, to point to and say that to a priest, to point to, well, that holiness and holiness of priests is the response to all that.
Let me follow up in this. I'll put this out there for whoever wants to address it. I've thought a lot about this question and how to ask it, and I haven't quite come up with the perfect way, so I'm just going to ask it and we'll see what happens. we've heard a lot about clericalism over the last year. And there's been a lot of different people who've meant one thing or another by clericalism. There are several different definitions sort of operative out there. But there's a sort of fundamental meaning to clericalism, or generic meaning to clericalism, I should say, which gets at a sense of a divide between those who are set apart for the ministerial priesthood and the laity. And that divide is, in some sense, obviously a real thing. It's an ontological divide, if you will. At the same time, there is a sense among laity, and I don't think I'm just projecting here, that our priests, our clergy, they know more about what's going on in the chancery or in the seminary than the rest of us. There's a sense that they have sort of inside knowledge. And certainly to some extent that's got to be true. Over the last year, there has been this question that crops up: who knew what and when? Okay, and sometimes that question is asked about very specific persons and very specific actions. But there's a broader sense in which our priests are afforded, or assumed to be afforded, a kind of cynicism about the human side of the church that the laity are often in the dark about, or presumed to be in the dark about. That our priests can be cynical about themselves, their own priesthood, and their brother priests. That presumption of cynicism, for which there is actually some evidence, I think is a part of the breach of trust. That's whether that manifests itself in living a double life with regards to sexual morality, whether that means living a comfortable life materially, and all the different ways that this manifests itself. How do you react to that sentiment? This idea that the laity looks at their priests and suspects cynicism.
Kind of a broad question, but it's a good question, and I think it does strike at something that isn't often brought out in these discussions, which is not just who knew what when, like you said, but is there a kind of a wink and a nod kind of attitude among priests towards other priests? It's broad. I mean, that's clearly that has happened, and I'm sure it's still happening right now. But I also think that my own experience of priests, knowing a lot of priests and a lot of seminarians, now priests, and now seminarians that are in formation, my experience is that while I can't speak so much for older generations where maybe there's a little bit more of that, my experience is that especially those who I was in the seminary in 2002 as Father Scalia had already been ordained. He's older than I am, much older. And I have to say that there was a real desire on the part of seminarians, as Father Boxey said at the very beginning, to just be a good, faithful priest. And that deep desire for fidelity, knowing that you're a sinner and that you're gonna, you're gonna fail, you're gonna fall in certain ways. But it's not just a degree, it seems to me, of kind of, of quantity, but of quality, that it's not just, there are some sins that are simply beyond the pale and that are not compatible with being a faithful priest. I'm not sure that distinction is always made. It's like, well, he's a sinner. Well, no, that is, it's one thing about, confessing whatever, this kind of the small sins of everyday life and impatience and different things and it's another thing to do some of these horrific things that these individuals have done. And we can't just sort of say, well, we're all sinners. I do think that there's been a greater clarity and a greater understanding that we have to be more consistent in our priestly lives, not just ourselves, but holding our brothers more consistent, and bishops holding their own priest sons more consistent. And I do think that is a necessary part of, and frankly, one of the silver linings in this terrible cloud that's over our head is that there is a greater clarity that we, what those seminarians experienced in 2002 and have continued to since then needs to become not just how we view ourselves, but also how we view our brothers, and that we have to hold each other more accountable than we have. And I think that's going to, if that happens, then our Lord will do what he does generation after generation, which is to bring great good even out of the greatest of evils. and he respects our freedom. And so we see the devastating effects of human freedom, but his arm is not shortened, and his sovereignty is never impinged by our freedom. And he's going to draw good out of this if we just let him. And I think that's one of the great goods that's going to come out of it, in my opinion.
One of the things that came out in 2018, I think it just revealed in many quarters a painfully superficial living out of priesthood and of friendships among priests, and so speaking of clericalism and the ontological distinction, that priests need to, I think, hold one another accountable, as my junior stated, and deepen friendships and deepen priestly fraternity. That is one of the things that I have heard again and again, is that there is a distinction, and a priest priests need to hold one another accountable, because if that's not happening, then it's just not happening at all, right? And so, it's interesting. I don't know if y'all remember the second reading on the Sunday after the Pennsylvania grand jury report was Ephesians 5, and all about the headship of the husband, and that headship, of course, is ordered to sacrifice, self-sacrifice, and it just struck me as such an apt reading, because, well, if there is a gift given to priests, it's not given to the laity. It is for the purpose of sacrifice, and priests need to hold one another accountable in exhorting one another to that sacrifice and calling one another out on things. I mean, the great question about Cardinal McCarrick was who knew what when, and I think the answer is a lot of people kind of heard things, but nobody was ever actually close enough to him to speak about it, and that's what I mean about a superficiality among the clergy, is not being close enough, not allowing the depth of a fraternal relationship so that someone can correct you.
Look, on this theme of accountability and fraternal correction, I'll throw it to the priests who are even younger than Father Griffin. For either the two of you, Father Boxer or Father Fish, you're young priests. You are starting out your priesthood at a particularly difficult time. How do you look at your brother priests who are 20, 30, 40 years your senior? How do you, I don't know, you live with one of the auxiliary bishops, you're in the same parish as one of the auxiliary bishops in the archdiocese. How do you look at your brother priests, or how do you interact with your bishops on something like an even playing field? How do you say to an older priest, you need to look at this differently, or you need to stop doing this, or you need to start doing this? Not that most of your job is fraternal correction, but how do you approach that if you are the low man on the totem pole?
Yeah, that's a difficulty and a challenge, and I don't want to say too much about the generational divide, because there are some differences.
We want you to talk about the generation.
There are some differences between us who have been recently formed and those who were formed decades ago. I will say this, that a couple decades ago. I will say this though. First off, I mean, those priests that are 20, 30, 40 years my senior, I thank them for their faithfulness, and I do thank them for their service, because they were formed in a time and an era where many of their friends and many of their colleagues left. So I appreciate their service and respect that their faithfulness to the priesthood and the ministry. And I guess in terms of it's different than I can speak to my good friend Father Matt here much differently than I can my pastor Bishop Campbell, obviously. But I think again what it goes back to is even with the older generation of priests, starting to build those relationships, and I think that us younger priests, we have to realize that, we don't have all the answers. We certainly have, I think, an energy and a zeal and an enthusiasm to be the priest that God has called us to be in the church right now, today in 2019, that the church needs. But also to respecting those who have come before us, respecting those who have been faithful all of these years and seen way much more than we have, right now. But I think for us and the older generation of priests is about building those relationships and trying to find as much common ground and mutuality so that we can both grow together, so that we can both move forward and move our church forward. I think that's at least that's the approach that I take, and I think that's one that I found success with.
Yeah, I would only just add, I don't want to sound platitudinous. It sounds silly in a way, but it's one thing you learn in formation where you actually have to do this in seminary. You have to, there's times of fraternal correction, even peer evaluation is part of the formation process now. And it can be really difficult to correct a brother, and in particular to correct someone who's your senior. I think with matters like this that are so essential to priestly life, you have to ask for the grace. And again, it sounds simplistic, but so much of, I think, what was lacking in priestly life and in priestly virtue that we've seen in these examples is, and I've heard this from my own formators when they tell us this is what happens when a guy starts to go down this road. Usually the first thing that happens is he stops praying. And again, it's a simple thing, but the heart of the priesthood is this reality of the spiritual life is the most real thing in the universe, and that you're in a spiritual battle and you've given your life to save souls. And that can sound pious, it can sound romantic, but at some point you have to come back to it as the most real thing in your priesthood. And if you're not coming back to prayer as the most important resource in your priesthood to do the most important things, maybe even more important than training you've had, than natural abilities and environment, but to really come to the Lord and say, I can't do this, you have to do this, and I have to depend on you, and I'm going to ask you specifically for this grace, and then go forward, it's not going to happen. And so many times, it sounds simple. I think what we've seen, the disappointments of so many men, probably began when they made that decision to stop praying. And so that's the first and most important thing to do to correct that.
Going to jump in?
You may.
And which speaks to the need for priestly fraternity and somebody close enough to the priest to say, are you praying? Yeah. And every priest having a spiritual director, a regular confessor, those things are essential. But then also friends close enough that he's allowed to be close enough that they can call him out on things and say, are you praying? And, being faithful to the divine office, to the rosary, whatever else, and praying, not just saying prayers, not just reciting prayers. So I think that those priests who start, sort of isolating themselves from the correction of other priests, and to the point about clericalism, one of the reasons it's difficult to hang out with other priests is because they know what you're up to. They're on to you, right? Parishioners are like, oh, yes, Father. Oh, Father, that's wonderful, right? Not all parishioners in Falls Church, Stephen. But priests will say, well, no, you're wrong on that. And they'll challenge your brilliant insight about Sunday's gospel, right? And they'll call you, that's difficult, but it's a very important thing. And St. Paul says, love one another with the affection of brothers. I have 4 brothers. That line kind of scares me. There's something about brothers that, that challenges. We should be challenged. And I think that's precisely why some guys draw back. And it's precisely why they should not and shouldn't be allowed to.
This gets to a question this is a lovely segue. over the last year, but even going back to 2002, the church has decided part of the church's addressing of these problems has been a zero tolerance policy. There are all kinds of protocols now for various kinds of misbehavior. Have you seen, let me preface this. I have heard anecdotally from priests and from some bishops that the relationship, the fraternal relationship between priests, but especially between priests and their bishop, fraternal-paternal relationship in that case, has become more precarious on these grounds. That if a priest can come to his spiritual father and say, Bishop, I struggle with this, or I've got this problem, or I need help with this thing, a father can help him. But these days, a priest comes to his bishop and says, I've got this problem, or I've done this thing, or I have this challenge, or this addiction. And the bishop's response, out of necessity, is, thank you for coming forward. We have a protocol for that, and you are now in it. The church's attempt to correct these problems through certain procedures or protocols, has it really put this much strain on the relationship between brother priests and their bishop? Has it not? Are there differences? I assume it varies in some sense between diocese to diocese. Can any of you speak to that dynamic? How it has changed over time, perhaps the priests who've been around a little bit longer, or are you ever hesitant to talk to a brother priest or a bishop about something because the environment is different now?
I can't speak to whether or not it's changed, but as a vicar for clergy and somebody who's sat in on a lot of these meetings, well, I know the perception is out there that I can't come forward with a problem because then what will happen? It
would depend on the problem, presumably, but yeah,
it depends on the problem, right? But so I know that perception can be out there. The protocols, only kick in when they involve something illegal. When it involves a priest struggling with something and coming to his spiritual father and saying, "I'm struggling with this." My experience now under two bishops has been great solicitude and okay, well let's see what we can do to help you out. You're a priest and you're my priest, and we want to see what can be done to help you. So that you can be a good priest and just see where this goes. But it's not been my experience that just any problem that's brought forward immediately the guy's taken out of line and that's it. So I do know that perception's there, and I imagine it's true in some places because there is a fear of legal action or of a friend of mine said in 2002, he said, "For years we did not have justice, and now we won't have mercy." And that was, I think, it's pretty good line that there can be this overcompensation, and I suspect that there's the perception of that, and perhaps it's true in some places, but that's certainly not been my experience.
And actions speak louder than words. You see the example around you of priests who have had struggles and had to go to the archdiocese. And at least I can just speak for my experience. I think a lot of guys in the Archdiocese of Washington, priests in the Archdiocese of Washington, we know a number of our brother priests who've had to take time away, have had to go to a treatment center. And the examples I can think in my mind right now, as a whole, these guys have gone through this challenging experience and been supported, maybe even exemplary so, by the Archdiocese, by different archbishops and their brother priests. And I know them now to be back in ministry and doing really well. When you've seen that and you know that the guys have had the experience and they've spoken to the vicar of clergy or the archbishop, and it's been a good experience and they've been supported. And so when at the convocations and different events, when they really try to say and to emphasize that you can trust us, you can come forward with this, please talk to us. When you see what happens when guys do it and guys are taken care of, that gives you the motivation, the reason to say, I can trust this.
Maybe just add one thing, and that is, as Father Scalia said, I think this experience has been different in different parts of the country, I'm sure different parts of the world, where that level of distrust has become something that has hindered that relationship, that paternal relationship of the bishop to his priest. I think it's without a doubt that has happened probably everywhere to some extent, some more than others, and sometimes probably justified. I'm thinking of some priests right now who I think were not treated well by their bishop when they went in with a problem, with a difficulty, or just needing advice or something like that, and then feeling like they should have brought in a lawyer with them or something like that. That stuff is going to happen and has happened, and I think it's destroyed some or deteriorated some of that trust. And I think that's, just as priests, as you started at the beginning, how do we rebuild trust? Priests have to rebuild trust by being good, faithful priests, generous priests, holy priests. And bishops need to rebuild trust too, with their people, but also with their priests. And I think good bishops are doing that, and bad bishops aren't, And I think that is a really essential thing, because this is not just an institution. This is a family, it's a spiritual family. And the great crisis, I believe, that we have right now is that priests have forgotten who they are. They're forgotten that they're fathers. Fathers don't do this to their children, and they don't tolerate anyone who does do it to their children, right? And that's that if we could get back, that's why I wrote that book, on fatherhood. It's just so essential we get back to the core of what we are as priests. And when we do that, then I think the relationships, not just with our people, but also with our bishops and among each other, will also be healed. And in my opinion, in many parts of the country, I believe, frankly, in this part of the country, that is happening. But it's going to take some time.
I want to turn now to a second line of inquiry, broaden the focus a bit, and I'm going to do something that maybe should embarrass me, maybe shouldn't. I'm going to quote Twitter, but it's Father Fish on Twitter, so sorry, Father Fish.
It doesn't count.
Twitter.
A certain priest of the Archdiocese of Washington recently tweeted, "Working for the Catholic Church in America in 2019 feels something like working for blockbuster movies in 2005. We're still arguing about how we should display the DVDs, and meanwhile our current model and customer base is about to collapse." Now, before I let Father Fish qualify that in all the ways he doesn't think the church is actually going to collapse, et cetera, I want to use that analogy, which I found actually a very powerful analogy, as a jumping off point to ask our panelists how they see the crisis in the broader context of challenges that the church faces. We're all familiar with the drumbeat of bad news about declines in the number of Americans, the percentage of Americans that identify as Catholic, the rise of the nuns. We're familiar with the massive demographic challenges that many dioceses and archdioceses face. It tends to vary regionally, but for example, the Diocese of Pittsburgh is talking about closing a huge percentage of their parishes. We see this in sort of the old bastions of Catholicism in the United States, especially in the Northeast and in the Midwest. There's a financial component to all of this too. Not just are the folks in the pews ponying up in the weekly collection, but there are larger concerns about the financial viability of the model of a lot of the church's ministries. Catholic schools are cash strapped, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on and on. It's not a lot of rose-colored images when you look at the future of the Catholic Church, at least from where we're sitting right now. And then comes 2018 and all of that. How does this crisis change, or does it clarify your perception of what the church needs to be doing right now to fulfill its mission? Has the abuse crisis in particular clarified your view of things? Has it brought things to your attention that you hadn't otherwise considered? What does this moment mean for the bigger picture about the future vitality of the church in the United States?
I'm not gonna comment on Father Fish's lack of faith in the indefectibility of the church.
Brothers, right?
No, I think it is clarifying in what Father Griffin touched on, which is the spiritual fatherhood of the priest. And I think even before the scandals hit or came back, I think that was the heart of a lot of discussion among priests is recovering that understanding of the priesthood and getting away from, the priest is just a buddy, or as a glorified YMCA coach, or as just a bureaucrat or administrator, but as a father. And I think a lot of priests had already been trying to cultivate that sense and recover that. And because I think that's been one of the things that one of the greatest losses in the past 50 years is that sense of the priest's spiritual fatherhood. The scandals really they shed a very painful light on the reality of that loss, and I think that's at the heart of any renewal in the church. And whatever other proposals there are for renewal, without that dimension of the priesthood, everything else is bound to fail.
Do you want to defend yourself against the charge of heresy, or okay? Then I'll jump in. It seems to me that what I like about the analogy, the Blockbuster analogy, is that we can all fall into this temptation to kind of enter into maintenance mode, kind of keep the thing going, pay the bills, and that obviously is, I think, it's devastating for any institution, and there is an institutional, obviously, dimension of the Catholic Church. And yet, that is not really what the church is, or who the church is. Right? The church started with 12 kind of ignorant fishermen, and now it's 2 billion plus people have been baptized who are now alive. And so that kind of getting back to the core of who we are means, I think, also being able to kind of break out of maintenance mode and kind of go into more of an apostolic or patristic, or maybe a patristic kind of model of engaging the world in such a way that with confidence in what we have and what the gospel is, and how beautiful and joyful it is to live a Christian life, and the beautiful gift of Jesus and his church to us, and being convinced of that ourselves. And I find one of the more disturbing kind of trends is sort of a great deal, a lack of confidence in proclaiming Jesus Christ and in his resurrection, and feeling that we have to sort of be in a constant state of apology with the church, with the world, and sort of a sense of accommodation constantly. I think that we need to sort of take this opportunity to renew our confidence in who Jesus is and in the church that he founded. And when we do that, then we also kind of realize that our own vocation is to be faithful. It's to become saints. That's what St. Josemaria said. These crises are crises of saints. He wasn't talking about this crisis, but in a sense he was talking about this crisis. And that's always the need. There was a time in France in the 18th century when a lot of people, including faithful Catholics, said the church is done. Over, it's just gone, and that was right before the 19th century and the great flowering of French Catholicism and all the saints that came up from that, and it changed the world. We just never know what the Holy Spirit has in store, but we have to respond, and that means we have to become saints. That's the answer, I think.
I just want to jump in. 2008, a man came up to me after Mass, and he elderly man. He wanted to tell me about this article that he had read years ago about the two greatest corporations in the United States, General Motors and the Catholic Church. And he thought this was a great article. This is 2008 when General Motors was like being bailed out by the federal government, right? But he thought this was great, that this spoke so well of the Catholic Church that it ranked right up there with General Motors. And that, to me, just that was it. That captured the problem, is that if we're viewing this as just a corporation, then we're going to fall into maintenance mode, and we're going to think just the goal is just to keep keep the revenue coming in, keep the schools filled up and everything like that, and we'll lose sight of proclaiming the gospel. And because sometimes when you proclaim the gospel in its fullness, you actually might not have as many people in the pews or as many children in the schools, but a corporation's goal is to make money and to get people in. That's not the church's goal.
The point of the analogy was.
What's the next question?
Yeah. We ran out of time. The point of the analogy was it's interesting. Was actually first rather limited, just a critique of more the management of certain authorities and dioceses in the church. But I think it's made me think since then of how, and this was certainly my experience before last year and even before 2002. I grew up in a lot of ways, when things were getting better and better in the Catholic Church in the United States, with so many signs of growth, even with certain things changing, especially under Pope John Paul's pontificate, there was a real sense of optimism and all the talk of the new springtime, and seeing all these vocations that were growing, and influence even in the public sphere and politics, and the hope of certain things changing, World Youth Days, I mean, the list goes on and on. And I think for a lot of people, the abuse crisis has been something that has taken away, or it's worse than tarnished. And for a lot of people, it's proven that to be a bit of an illusion, that there's actually something else existing within the church. And I think that's always been the hardest part, is when you have this faith in the church, and it's weakened or even broken for some people, tragically. But at the same time, I would bet that most of the people here tonight have had an experience, or continue to have experiences, of really amazing, vital Catholic culture in their life. It may be at a certain micro level that the Post doesn't see or isn't writing about. If you go next door on any given day, it's amazing the number of people you can see going to Mass every day, in line for confessions. You go just a little bit more up the road, you see a seminary that's full. I think every year we're building a new wing. I can't keep track anymore. Seriously, I'm not joking, because
I feel that way too.
Because we've had so many guys enter our seminary. A lot of these things, we don't talk about them, or they don't get the same attention. And it's not to discount the true crisis that has occurred. But at the same time, I think this is how renewal happens, is that God works through these communities that are faithful. And they often start small, like a lot of things in our faith, but they really are a source of renewal for the whole church. And you look at the virtues and the models that are given in those small, vital centers of Catholic culture. And I think they're telling us how we're supposed to answer this abuse crisis. It's the accountability of holiness, really. It's not a bureaucracy or a corporation that's trying to manage profits or things like that. Whatever a blockbuster analogy is worth, at the end of the day, it doesn't come close to the true reality of the church, which is spiritual, which is divine, which means it's guided by God, which means it is indefectible, and that God works in these ways. He's always going to work by beginning holiness again and again in a certain way. I'd shared this essay with Father Griffin last year. I'd never read it before. I just kind of randomly encountered it, but it was an essay that now St. John Henry Newman wrote, where he compared the example of Savonarola with Philip Neri, and how it's tempting to want the Savonarola and want someone who's going to come in and start a revolution and hold people accountable and shake everything up. And we're going to get action now and make changes now, and it's going to happen in 2-3 years, and everything's going to get better. But it burns out, and it's not effective. You look at what Philip Neri did, and how what he did was so much smaller, and on this subtle level of changing hearts over years, and people not noticing what he was doing, but this spiritual revolution of a much different order that was beginning in Rome, and the fruits that came out of that last, versus the flash in the pan, as it were, of the Savonarola. I really recommend that essay if you can find it. But I think that says something to us today about what counts and how to fix the problems.
Father Boxey, what's your plan for Netflix? So for what comes next?
Well, piggybacking off of Father Griffin, this crisis at least has crystallized for me the importance of what our mission really should be, and that's preaching the gospel. That is going out, sharing the rich treasure that we have in our Catholic faith. And this particular crisis has shown me, because it's been in the media a lot. I feel like every week we're getting another news article in the Post about some bishop or some diocese releasing list or something like that. It's shown to me, crystallize that we're in a particular scandal, crisis right now, but also that there are many other issues that we are facing that equally need to be addressed. And I guess going to Father Fisher's point about, the blockbuster, the thing is collapsing. And for me, where I'm standing, as an African American, as a Black priest in this archdiocese, in trying to fulfill my mission about going to those whom I'm entrusted to, I've found that what people do want is Jesus Christ, and how we have at least failed to do that among all of our brothers and sisters. And, not to, change direction of the conversation, but I think that crystallizing an issue for me is, related to it is dealing with racism that is in our church and also in our country. I think that a lot of the winds that we are facing, politically, in our country are affecting our church. And one of the things that the sex abuse scandal has crystallized for me has been the seriousness of racism that goes on in our country and has been trickled down in our church. And I say that because my mission is to go out and bring Jesus Christ. And when I go out, and do the best that I can at doing that, I'm realizing that people just have not been ministered to. People's needs have not been addressed. People feel as though they don't have a voice or a seat at the table where they can be heard. And I guess to try to bring it back, this sex abuse scandal has just shown me that this is one of many issues that we have to face and address in the church, and we cannot discount too the fact of our mission of going out to everyone. Everyone needs to be ministered to, and I'm not sure if we haven't done a good job at doing that. So this scandal has crystallized for me how other scandals and crises that we need to address in our church, which hopefully will help us to prevent this blockbuster image that might be knocking down at our door.
So I like the direction you went with this. So how does the church? It must be frustrating for priests and bishops, and maybe for some of the rest of us too, that this is the thing that we spend so much of our time talking about. It's not the only thing we talk about, hopefully, but this is something that out of necessity we spend a lot of time and effort focusing on, whether it's bishops trying to put out fires or trying to come up with the right thing to say or try to avoid saying the wrong thing and all the rest of it. Some of us do it full time, right? So how does the church pivot from addressing this crisis, this self-inflicted wound, to all of the other things that the church really exists to do, whether it's addressing other issues in our polity, in our society, or in our church, or simply the mission of the church to evangelize people? How does the church pivot without seeming to sort of put things behind them and, let's not talk about that anymore, we want to move on? This has been an inflection point in the life of the church in this country. How do we leverage it in a way that helps the church going forward without doing a disservice to the gravity of the evils that have been committed and that need to be accounted for?
I think maybe just an initial stab at thinking through that. When thinking about a person who has gone through a very difficult time, maybe committed some great sins, whatever it may be, gone through life and received God's mercy, those sins never go away, right? Those sins, the effects of those sins continue even when they've been forgiven. And they are kind of integrated, if it's done well, those are the lessons from those sins and are integrated into their life as they move forward. And that's one of the ways that God can bring goodness out of even our own sinfulness. And I think something similar needs to happen in the church, that it's neither simply moving on and putting it behind us. Let's get, next chapter. We're glad we're through that. That would be a mistake both for the individual in dealing with their past sins, and it would be a mistake for the church. And yet at the same time, there is a sense in which sins can be forgiven and one can kind of grow from them and become stronger even through the experience of receiving God's mercy and in becoming somebody who doesn't commit that sin again, right? And I think that's what we all need to feel the confidence in, is that those who are in leadership, including ourselves, but really just all the Catholic people, having the sense that we're in this together and that we have to feel confidence that these kind of mistakes, which are totally avoidable, just for example, in my own line of work, making sure that the right men are selected and formed, the right men are selected and they're properly formed to be good, faithful fathers. Of course, they're going to be sinful, like the rest of us. But the idea of them committing some of these horrible things that he read about in the Pennsylvania report is hopefully not even, it's just totally beyond the pale of something that they would, and slowly restoring the trust, that I think most priests frankly deserve. But it's that kind of both end, I think, remembering and growing from, but at the same time recognizing that we do need to move into a purified and hopefully renewed church in the future.
And it might not be a pivot either. I think one of the best ways is how bishops and priests respond to crises that they're dealing with or dealing with this abuse crisis. They can respond to it in a way that ultimately can speak about Jesus Christ and remind people of Jesus Christ and proclaim through the way that they treat those who've been victims and the way they take care of them and the way they try not to hide things or to make excuses. I think we see that. There's a way that someone can just avoid responsibility, and there's a way that someone can accept that in a truly Christian way. And then second, I think we're noticing that we're starting to see the fruits everywhere of the sexual revolution. And it's not just happening in the Catholic Church. And it's beginning in many institutions that are starting to come to grips with this and seeing how so many people have been taken advantage of and exploited sexually. And it's, who knows, but it wouldn't surprise me if this continues to get worse and worse and worse. And it might be an interesting pivot in a way, but a turn of providence if because we had to go through it first and we had to go through it so terribly, that there might be a word of encouragement or some other kind of prophetic word that we can offer someday in the near future to a culture that is really going to be hurt and struggling everywhere with this, and in a really devastating way. And maybe at that point we'll say, wow, the fact that we had to go through this and learn how to deal with this in a truly Christ-like way, now we can offer something to people and not just judge them or say, hey, isn't it nice now that the shoe's on the other foot, but we can actually reach out to them in mercy. Might be the whole point of it.
I think it's summarized in the wounds that our risen Lord still has, right? He doesn't they're different, of course, on Easter Sunday, but they still speak to the suffering that he endured for our sake, and the church suffering these wounds, self-inflicted, but suffering these wounds can become more merciful because as a body, she knows she knows what it means to be wounded. And her ministers know also the burden of shame and of fear and guilt and all of those things that we've suffered because of the sins of our brothers. I think also it calls us to it. This is ultimately an identity crisis, and I think that's we've lost sight of who we are, and so by regaining that helps us to proclaim the gospel better, and being able to look back to where we didn't know who we were, and not only did we fail to proclaim the gospel at that time, but we did grave harm. But once we recover the identity of who the church is and who our priests are, then we can more effectively proclaim the gospel.
One of the things that we've been dealing with here at Catholic University and through the Catholic Project is this idea of what the laity can do to help the church in this moment of crisis. And I think there are sort of two ways to pose that question. One is to ask that question in terms of sort of what offices can lay people hold, which is sort of a division of power question, which frankly I think is a less interesting question than the other question, which is if the laity are living out the vocation of the laity as they ought to, as envisioned by Lumen Gentium in the Second Vatican Council. If the laity is living that vocation, what then does the church look like? It's a much more difficult question to answer, I think, but it's a much more interesting question to ask. Part of the challenge going forward, and I want to move to a sort of more outward-looking, perhaps a little bit more hopeful, encouraging mode, is that it is not going to be just the priests and bishops who fix the church. One of the lessons sometimes it's those who have been harmed who have to be the one to do the fixing. I'm thinking specifically earlier this year we had a tremendous event where survivors of clerical sexual abuse came to meet with bishops to help the bishops do their job better, not to chastise, not to admonish, but to say, this is our church too. We want to help. How can we help? That's a really powerful example. There is a sense, of course, in which this is a crisis of clerical sexual abuse, and clericalism is talked about a lot. But getting us out of this ditch we're in, to borrow a phrase, is going to require lay people as well. What would you say to encourage lay people to start living their vocation in a way that will help the church, that will make the work of restoration and repair a work of collaboration rather than further division and infighting? How can lay people help the church back on its feet? What's the best thing to be doing? Pick one thing, the best thing. Father Boxey, I'll start with you.
Yeah. I would just say just go back to basics. Prayer. I think that prayer is absolutely essential for the life of the church. We as priests and clerics, we are called to be men of prayer. And I think that in order to help us go forward, that the laity, the faithful, need to keep us grounded in prayer. And likewise, the faithful need to be men and women of prayer. Listening to the Holy Spirit as He guides us, as He leads us, and seeing this too as that we're walking together, that we're in this together. It's not, priests and bishops up here and the laity, everyone else down here. It's really that we're disciples of Jesus Christ walking together. And I think that one thing that will certainly help will solidify that if all of us, recommit to that most fundamental aspect of discipleship. And that's all of ours, recommitment to prayer. No one can't stop praying. We can't be prayed up enough. And especially for, the attacks that the church receives, the attacks that, priests, clerics that are faithful are sort of down in the trenches with, we have to be, protect ourselves, through the power, of prayer. So that would be my one answer.
I think I don't know if it's renewal is the right word, but yeah, the apostolate, if you will, of the domestic church. One of the great gifts I've had in my life, so many of my friends that I went to college with at Steubenville have families now, are married and have children, and have been maybe the greatest witness to me in my life of apostolic virtues. I think we're all aware of how many young people have become estranged. The church seems to be following this pattern. Every generation, is worse than the next. More disaffiliation. And I think for a number of years, many people had this experience where, you'd go to mass on Sundays with your family, and that was important. It was understood. But then the rest of the week, the faith wasn't really talked about. It was assumed. It was in the background. Maybe you might pray at meals, but it was something that was more transparent in the culture. Maybe it was expected this would be given at schools. Regardless, I think we've seen, the effectiveness of that kind of model where our religion, the practice of our religion becomes something that is once a week or not talked about very much. What I've been inspired by and seeing my friends and their example of so many other Catholic families I've gotten to know, when it's clear to your children that your faith and your religion is the most important thing in your life, and every single day you talk about it and you practice it and you pursue it with love, with desire, and you teach your children every day how to pray, you teach them about the Lord, you teach them about Scripture, you teach them about the liturgy, how to love the liturgy, and you get them interested in the excitement and kind of the drama and the romance of the faith and all these things, and it becomes the most important part of your family life. Not the only thing, but it's unambiguously clear to your children that this is the most important thing in life. I think you can predict what's going to happen to these kids, and I've seen it with my friends' kids. I mean, you can't be sure of anything, but this is how you change a church ultimately: is you have holy families who have holy children who are inspired to live their vocations heroically to become saints. It's got to come from somewhere. And I think we're seeing it now. Again, some people may not see it, but the more that we can learn to teach families and parents how to do that and how to make the faith a central part of their life and to work on that lay apostolate that begins in the family and grows from that. And so for parishes and dioceses to provide resources and formation for parents, for families, that they can raise their children in this way, seems to me like the best bet.
I disagree. He said that far more eloquently than I could. I would just maybe add a point to that, and that is maybe saying the same thing in a different way. When I was writing this book on spiritual fatherhood, I was talking about the priesthood, of course, and celibacy and so forth. One of the things that I found most interesting myself, and that I think many married men, especially, but also women, sort of reading it in the light of spiritual motherhood, found very helpful, is the recognition that what binds us all together as Christians is this call to give life. And men do that in the nature of fatherhood, and women in the nature of motherhood, which are obviously distinct, complementary, but also both very powerful ways of giving life and living out our vocation, our common vocation, our baptismal vocation to give life. And some are called out from that in order to give life in a particular way as priests and as religious and in other ways. But that all of us are called to be spiritual mothers and fathers. St. John Paul II said it was actually a mark of spiritual maturity that we recognize our own call to become a spiritual father and a spiritual mother. And that recognition is something that I think unites all of us, whether single, young, old, married, priest, it doesn't matter. That if we each of us looks in at our own vocation, and that when we're faithful to our vocation, finding ways that we can give life to those around us, and that Jesus wants to do that through us, I couldn't agree more. That is through prayer and that domestic church and sort of finding that common bond, that it's not sort of the job of the priest, and it's not the job of the religious. It's not that we're in this family together and that all of us have that call to give life in the order of grace.
So I'm not sure what there's left for me to say about this, but I was asked a little while ago by a young adult, Father, how can we help? And I didn't give the answer that I think I should have. I think what I should have said was get married, and have children, and have a lot of them. And then you will inevitably become a man of prayer, right? I mean, these things lead to one another. But it's an interesting thing to the complementarity of married life and the priesthood, and I would say religious life as well. They've experienced a decline. They've shared a history of decline in the past 50 years. It's not like the priesthood has declined, but marriage is doing great. No, they're both suffering, and which one led to the other. But as they've both been sort of dragging one another down, if you will. And so I think recovering a sense of the complementarity of that is important. Some of the best corrections I've received in my priesthood have come from mothers of large families, just pulling aside, said, "Father, this, that, or the other," and that's great. And I think also having high expectations of your priests. Father Griffin said earlier, some people say, well, they're only human. Well, some things that were done were extreme, were just horrific, right? And not just human error. But I've lamented recently that one of the greatest things, and people mean it as a line of praise when they say, "Oh, you will love Father so and so. He's so normal." Okay. I mean that's it. That's like the highest praise we get. So normal.
So you don't get it.
Other guys do, right? But expecting more and expecting and really holiness. I mean, and of priests, and not settling for just somebody who happens to be there, but really desiring that the priest be holy and lead you to holiness.
It can be so sad when, I think we've all had this experience, every priest has, of people have children and they see a priest and there's an apprehension, and you can detect it, right? That wasn't there before. And in some way we have to find a way to restore that confidence that you can have your children around priests, and that you have to be able to trust priests. And I think all of us, I'm sure, start thinking about priesthood at a young age, and you can think about those priests that you first looked up to, that you got to know. And maybe it wasn't a deep friendship, but a kind word or an example, it really can mean so much. And I think when you see families that have good relationships with priests and with religious, and you see that relationship that Father Scalia was talking about, you see how that bears fruit in this great culture of life and civilization of love that comes out of that. It's so sad when that, because of our own faults, our mistakes, that people say, I don't know if I can trust priests anymore. I don't know if I can have my child around priests. So we have to find ways to, of course, being responsible. And I think it's good that we have these rules now with child protection. And that can be a challenge at times about, you can't take a child driving in the car anymore somewhere, or maybe things that could happen years ago. But we have to find ways still to have children around priests in positive ways.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in, before we open up for questions, I think we can give a little round of applause now in case anybody has to run out. We have two gentlemen who have or will shortly have microphones in their hands to distribute them for people who have questions that they would like to ask of our panel. We're getting them passed out. If you want to raise your hand, a couple of rules. Please do try and pose your question in the form of a question. Ask what you like, but please be respectful. We had a question down here, right here. Identify yourself if you feel that's necessary.
I'm Mark Zimmerman, editor of the Catholic Standard newspaper of the Archdiocese of Washington. I want to ask you about the wounded flock. That's the title of this talk. Last year, the wounds were very raw. This year, they might be more like scars. But I want to ask all the priests in this panel, what are your insights for how the wounded flock can find healing? And I know there's different levels of healing needed, because some have been directly abused. Some are family members of those. Some are parishioners their trust has been dashed. Some are people who work in the church who know some of these priests or bishops. So how can the wounded flock find healing?
That I don't know that admits of sort of just one response. My experience last year was that all the raws were all the nerves were all raw, and it depended on where people were coming from, and people who were equally outraged about things, and rightly, would end up arguing with each other because their outrage was focused on different things. Some were focused on why on helping the victims. Others are focused on punishing the priests. Others were focused on, why the cover up and things. So people are coming from so many different perspectives, and I think there just comes a point where a priest has to simply just listen to some very uncomfortable things, and not. I mean, if his given temperament hypothetically is to respond and give a rebuttal, he has to just listen and allow some very uncomfortable. Allow himself to hear some very uncomfortable and difficult things, and they might not be right. The person might be all over the place, might be mistaken on things, and I think the temptation is to say, well, actually it's this, that, or the other. No. I think that's going to be the first step, is just allowing people to give expression to that and to hear them out.
It seems to me as well that the supernatural outlook that can be obtained only through an interior life, through prayer, is essential to see not only the wounds and the scars and the evil that's been done, but also the many blessings that the church continues to bring into the world, the many good and holy, faithful families and priests and bishops, and to sort of see the good as well as the bad. I think all of us can have that tendency to sort of go right to the point of where the darkness is. And I think that I don't know if that can be done purely humanly. So it seems to me the healing happens with an interior life, and frankly with time. Sometimes there's just forgiveness that is needed. Forgiveness, which also recognizes the need for real justice to be done, but that there is a need for forgiveness for the wounds that, even if they are kind of unseen wounds, that we've kind of, and I think all of us are kind of in that same boat. We're all finding our way forward in this thing. And having to realize that what has been done is something that's never going to go away. And yet, with that supernatural outlook, I think, and some time, I think there will be genuine healing. I don't think there's any magical answer to that, though. There's no instant answer anyway.
I would reiterate what Father Griffin said. I think if you talk to people, if you do ministry with people in all sorts of areas of life who experience wounds, I occasionally help out with doing some ministry for giving talks or retreats for women with Father Dan Leary, who does the Anima Christi Institute, a lot of retreats. And a talk that I've often given in those retreats is the difference between forgiving and forgetting. And oftentimes, I don't know if women maybe have a more acute sense of justice, and if they've suffered a wound, there can be this message of you've got to forgive, meaning you've got to get past it, you've got to get over it, you got to put it behind you. And I think there can be this sense of but it hasn't been made right, and I'm ignoring the fact that this injustice was done, and I have to kind of deny this, and it can create this resentment deep inside. And there's a real powerful point of entry there spiritually, where to understand that forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. The reason we can forgive is because God is making all things right. This is an eschatological principle of our faith. It's not going to happen today. It's not going to happen tomorrow. But we believe that in the fullness of time, no one gets away with anything. And no injustice finally just goes unpunished. And, there comes a point where we see that even in our own lives and our own actions. But this is what we believe, that our God is a God of justice, and Christ's recapitulation involves just as much making all things new, and that these things in our own life, these brokennesses, these wounds, these hurts, that all things ultimately will be made new again and will be restored and will be healed. And if that isn't true, then there's something lacking in what we believe in the fullness of redemption. And so when we've had an experience of a wound, or we see even worse, an experience of a crime that's been done to us or to a family member, we can't just get past it. We have to believe that in God's time, right, He will make this right. And that's what happens on Good Friday, is that Christ actually fulfills justice, and it opens itself up. This is pretty theological, but I think important in a spiritual way, to this eschatological reality of this is our hope, that one day all things will be made new again. And this is the new creation. It's not half measures. That's not the God we believe in. And so even in these worst kinds of crimes against children, We can't just get past this stuff. We have to hope that God will make this right as well. And all these things that were taken and stolen from these children will be restored to them in the fullness of time. And you really have to pray on that and make this a part of your faith, that hope. And then you're able to forgive because you know that God is making all things right.
Yeah, not much to add. Mark, to your question, I think we also have to realize that, we as priests, we have been wounded as well. We're part of the church as well. So I think walking with others who at various stages of wounds and healing, simply being with them in the pain, in the hurt, in the ugliness, in the wound, and allowing them the space, as Father Scalia said, so that we can just simply hear them out. And I think part of that is very cathartic. Part of that is part of the healing process, is just simply being with them, as fathers, as shepherds, just as, if we were to have a child, one of our own, that broke their leg, or that they were bullied at school, just simply being with them and allowing them the space, and the time to simply get all of that hurt and that brokenness out.
Can I just mention one other thing? I think that the reaction of a lot of people has been sort of a kind of like a technological Gnosticism, and seeing, if I only know more things about this, then, I can make sense of it. And so just going down the rabbit hole of all of the articles, all of the blog posts, everything on the scandals and everything. And, they don't learn anymore about things. It doesn't actually help their wounds at all. It just gets people more upset. That knowledge of things, it actually doesn't increase their knowledge. They knew it was bad. Now they just know that it's bad even more. But that doesn't bring any peace. It's kind of a natural reaction. I want answers. But there comes a point you have to say, stop going online and looking and reading all of these things. People would come and they'd be very, very upset about these things and reading them. So, well, stop reading them. It's bad. Go pray. I mean, you don't need to know every detail. It's enough to know that these things are really, really horrific.
There's a question back here in the middle of the aisle.
Hello, fathers. Thank you for being fathers, firstly. My question is on the role of the laity. I'm curious to know, what role can we do if, say, for instance, if we were working with someone who we see a collaboration with you and we would like to help you and support you in your role as fathers, but it's not welcome on the other side. How, in obedience, but also in collaboration, can we help support that? I'm also thinking in an example of a future canon lawyer, and I've known many who have, gotten fired because their job was to the truth and not to, what their bishop wanted.
I mean, yeah, it's two things. First of all, if it depends on what we're speaking about. If we're speaking about in an official capacity, like being a canon lawyer or something like that, one of the things that can be so difficult is there can be a real disparity of that relationship. I mean, you're sort of an employee in a sense of, and this is not just true of canon lawyers; it's true of all kinds of relationships in an employee type relationship in the church, and it's one of the real complications of that. Obviously, there's an appropriate level of that. I mean, there needs to be accountability for employees and so forth. And yet, when the employer is a priest or a bishop, it sort of adds a layer of complication. It's like you're being hired by your dad, or something like that. And it's like he's your dad, but he's also, or like dad is, the coach of the team or something like that. It's sort of these multi-layered sort of relationships, which get complicated. And I think that there's a potential for real injustice in that. And so I think we have to try to take the recourse that we would with any other kind of professional relationship if there's been an abuse of that kind of proper justice. Where I think it can be a little bit more sort of nuanced is in the relationship, in sort of the family relationship. of a spiritual father and or spiritual mother for that matter, and the lay faithful, because there is the relationship between a father and I think a lot of people mistake paternity for paternalism. That paternalism is really it's kind of the opposite of paternity. It's using your fatherhood to take advantage of your children or to keep them, to make them and keep them as children, And of course, that's not what a good father does. What a good father does is raise up brothers and sisters, and if a spiritual father is not doing that and is trying to kind of keep, out of it some insecurities or whatever, trying to keep his, really paternalistic relationship alive, then we're talking, the problem is not in you or somebody, the problem is in him, and that needs to be addressed at that level, of really hopefully really sort of praying and sacrificing for his conversion and maybe helping him in more direct ways to see that what he's doing is not really living spiritual fatherhood. He's living a kind of paternalism. So maybe those are two of the situations that could emerge. I don't know if there's any other thoughts.
Over here.
Thank you for the panel. I think we all needed to hear a lot of that, and it's just thank you all for being here and sharing your experiences. My name is Ben. I'm a sophomore here at Catholic U studying theology. You all talked a lot about priestly fraternity, more so specifically like fraternal correction. Since you all are diocesan priests, there's not that, commonness of like brotherhood, and it's more of like a priest to bishop kind of checks and balances. So I would just ask you, or one of you, or however many just speaking about the role of that fraternal correction in parishes that don't have a community. You also spoke about how there's been an obvious decline in vocations to the priesthood and religious life. And I've known a lot of people that say, my pastor is the only pastor that lives in his rectory, and he also is in charge of like 2 or sometimes even 3 other parishes because of the low number. So just that role of fraternal correction and brotherhood in the midst of all of the isolation and growing isolation.
Actually, I think this speaks to the blockbuster principle, okay? Because the model of the priest alone in the parish and sort of isolated. There are a lot of places now where priests are they're living together. They're making a decision to live together and then go out to the parishes. In different places in the U.S., there are initiatives, whether it's an oratory or something like that. But more and more priests seeing the need for a common life, not religious life, still remaining diocesan or secular priests, but establishing a common life together and sort of breaking away from what we've always done it this way, right? And finding a new way to do that, which will build up the fraternity of the priests and therefore help them to better serve those parishes.
So every month, Father Boxey and I and 3 other priests, we meet for a whole day, and we start the day off with a holy hour for the Blessed Sacrament, praying, and then we get lunch together, catch up on just what's going on in the world and just kind of fun stuff we talk about, and then we spend 2-3 hours sharing intimately what's going on in our lives. Following up on what happened from the last month, challenges, struggles, calling each other on, asking each other, are you praying? How's that thing that you talked about last time? And it happens every month. And we try to once a year take a longer period of time together away, like an overnight. We went up to a farmhouse up in Western Maryland last year. And most guys now that I know, certainly encourage you, and all the priests I know, they're part of these fraternity groups. You can't always control your assignment or what's going on there. I live by myself in my rectory, so I have to go out and make this fraternity as I can. Father Boxey's, I don't know, it was like 25 minutes up the road, but we take time to get together, stop by. If we're driving by each other's parish, just for a couple minutes to talk on the phone. It's what you do when you're friends, but you also recognize too that there's this obligation of brotherhood, and that I think a lot of us would like to go more in the direction Father Scalia is talking about, but at the same time, you can't just give up parishes, and sometimes you have to remain at that parish in the rectory locally because of the responsibilities there. So you do what you can to make fraternity happen, and it's a commitment, because if you can always find excuses about, I've got this thing and I can't make it, and then before you know it, you haven't seen your brother priest in weeks. So you have to say, I've got to talk to these guys. I've got to see them every week. I've got to make time for fraternity, like the group I was talking about, where we can correct each other and be accountable. If you make it a priority and a commitment, it happens. And I mean, I think Father Griffin can talk about this. I mean, I was told this every year as a seminarian, that this is an absolute priority.
Yeah, I mean, just just we as human beings, we've been made for community. We've been made for relationship, and I think it's extremely incumbent upon all priests. And I think this has been emphasized a lot in seminary, at least recently in seminary formation. That find a priest group. You have to have people that hold you accountable. We can't necessarily police ourselves. We need others to help us to live out our vocation, healthfully, faithfully, and fruitfully. And that's just in each human person. This need, this desire for relationship, this desire to be in community, and it doesn't stop with just because we become a priest. And to a certain extent, it's even more so because we don't necessarily just simply have, family, a natural family to go to. So it really does have to become a priority for all of us. And even those guys who may not think it's a priority, still trying to reach out, still trying to be intentional about, looking out after, a brother priest, because we are really our brother's keeper. We do have to look out, for one another. And for our well-being.
And this stuff was not part of formation 60 years ago. It's amazing when you look at, I was telling a couple guys earlier, I don't know if we've ever had a group of priests and bishops, particularly younger bishops in this country, that have ever been so well formed and trained and prepared. You think about, it's about as hard to get into the seminary as it is like the FBI at this point. You have to go several interviews. You have to have a full psychological interview. You have to write an autobiography. There's a number of tests. That's just to get in. And then there's at least 6 years of formation, continual formation, human formation, spiritual, academic, pastoral. It's so radically different than the way it was 60 years ago. And you think about, I wish in some ways that newspapers would write more about this, because you can get the sense that priests are still, that they're just living in these different worlds, and they're not formed, or we think that the way that it was is the way it is today. And it's incredible, the formation that priests are getting today. And we're trained and encouraged throughout these years of seminary. We learn in seminary how to have formation, how to have fun, in good, healthy ways, and how to talk to each other, how to call each other on, how to open up with each other. And after 6-8 years of that, right, then you can apply it in practice. It's a great gift that we have that now, that guys, they weren't trained in this way 60 years ago. So we have a lot to be thankful for because of our seminaries today.
And Jim, we are more privileged here in this regard than in some of the more remote dioceses, because the DC area has a very good and strong Catholic life, and the priests, I think, are much more closer knit than a lot of other places. But you go to other parts of the country where the parishes are few and far between, and they're closing down, and so I think that the strain is going to be much greater in different areas. I think the need for the priests to be more deliberate about it, and what you all said about the younger priests is absolutely right. In my experience as vicar for clergy, that the younger priests they're much more dialed in to getting together with other priests and making sure that they have those relationships. I heard years ago, I heard a line, at first it's kind of a funny line, that forced fraternity is no fraternity, which is kind of fun because, seminary, right? So, but then you think about it, like, wait a minute, all fraternity is forced. You never get to choose your brothers, right? And so realizing that and say, you know what, he's my brother, and I do have to reach out to him, and I have to be good to him and care for him.
There's a back here. Yep, right there.
Nathaniel Hurd. My wife ribs me a little bit because I get more choked up at ordinations than I do at weddings, and the reason for that is actually very simple. So for me, as a convert, the priest has always been a sign that God loves me, that Christ loves me right here, right now, not abstractly, right now. And that's been present throughout. It's one of the things that actually led me into seminary for a year. It obviously became clear I had a different vocation. But it's also one of the reasons why a lot of these questions we're asking tonight are so important. I wanted to ask the panelists a question about sort of the administrative and bureaucratic dimension of the episcopacy now, as well as the life of diocesan priests. It seems to me that what has emerged, particularly in the United States, is that pastoral centers and parishes are very heavy on the bureaucratic and administrative demands on bishops and priests. Those demands, I think, fundamentally make it very challenging to be fathers, to be sons, and to be brothers. A priest will go into an assignment as a pastor and say, I'm going to do things differently. I'm not going to be crushed as these others have been. And he ends up doing the same thing. And it's true when priests are named as bishops. I'm wondering, in your view, how can that be reimagined? And what can priests, bishops, and the laity do, including at the parish level, to help reimagine, rethink, and relive parish life and the episcopacy so that it's not almost totally consumed with bureaucratic and administrative demands?
I think that's so true that it's been a chicken and the egg kind of thing with respect to the functional view of the priesthood. Can sort of say, well, how did we get into this bind where priests so often, good men, many times, start to see themselves really primarily as bureaucrats and administrators, and that's true. That has happened in many cases. And I don't think that the sexual abuse I know that's not what the primary focus of the question is, but I don't think that flows necessarily only from that functional view of the priesthood. I sort of think it works the other way around as well. That is to say that a functional view of the priesthood has led to this situation where those men are sort of advanced sometimes, and I think historically have. They have kind of succeeded, if you will, in the clerical kind of career ladder because they've been effective administrators, not necessarily because they've been effective fathers. So I think it kind of plays both directions, where we see sometimes the failure of leadership in the church is precisely because, first of all, we have sort of collapsed under this, what I believe is frankly a more sort of Protestant view of ministry. And what I mean by that is that it's a focus on ministry which is not primarily about sacrifice or about who one is, but rather about what one does, right? And the programs that one runs, the administration, and and those things are important, of course. But that's not the primary self-understanding of the Catholic priesthood. The self-understanding is that not what I do, but who I am as a spiritual father. Just as your primary identity is not what you do as a father, but who you are as a father. And I think when we get that aligned and we get that calibrated again, I think we're going to see, and I think it is actually in process. I think a lot of young priests really are younger priests are sort of admirably resisting that. And it remains to be seen what will happen as they, go into more positions of leadership. But I think it's very possible to put in place in your life kind of firewalls to make sure that the primary focus of your life continues to be on being a father, and not just sort of paying the bills, as it were, or whatever the equivalent might be, and recognizing that our primary focus has to be on the salvation of souls, not on effective programs. That's one aspect of it. I think kind of that self-awareness. The other is, and you alluded to this, is that what is the role of the lay faithful, especially in parishes. And in my opinion, all these guys have more experience than I do, but in parishes. But I mean, my opinion is that there is a real untapped potential in many places for, people who are far more capable than I am in all kinds of fields, to be of more assistance. And it may be that sometimes, I don't think this is all the time, but sometimes it may be that the priest continues to be, CEO of that parish because he's so afraid of kind of letting go, in his own insecurities perhaps, of letting go of some of these areas where he wants to kind of retain some control. And again, that's not universal, but I think that can afflict some priests. And so the complaints they have of like, all I'm doing is the administration or whatever is a kind of self-inflicted wound often.
Yeah, and I think this speaks to the question that we had earlier about the role of the laity and helping priests. And this is a very practical thing. As a pastor of a large parish, yes, I gladly rely on a business manager and other laity in the parish and on the staff who handle all of those administrative things, and I oversee them, but I don't want those things to get in the way of don't want it to make me forget my identity as a priest, as Father Griffin was saying, and that the primacy of sacrifice, the primacy of the identity of the priesthood. And when Bishop Burbidge arrived in Arlington, one of the things he said to the chancery staff was, I want you to be working here so I can go out there and visit schools and things like that. And I thought to myself, well, I want to do that. Why does he get to do that? And now, I think that's. But I thought, well, that's kind of a good. That's a good way of going about it, and that's the way I think that a pastor has to do it in a parish. Is find the people there in the parish, whether volunteers or staff, who can handle those things. He can entrust them with these duties and responsibilities, so he can be freed up to first of all be a priest, and then second of all to do those things that only a priest can do.
Question over here. We have time for one, maybe two more.
Thank you, Fathers. I'm Thomas. I'm a senior here at CUA. And what one topic that I wish that you had touched on a little bit is the homosexual nature to the scandal. And because the church is very clear that anybody with a deeply seated homosexual tendency should not be admitted to the priesthood, should not be ordained. And just could you speak to what led to men with homosexual tendencies being ordained and what the church has done to respond to that?
Sure, you have to get it from Emmaus Road Publishing. Why celibacy? The father. No, it is such an important thing, and one always has to begin addressing this question by saying the church's understanding, because not everyone understands this, of how the church perceives her sons and daughters who struggle with same-sex attraction, and that they are called to the same degree of holiness as the rest of us. They're called to become great saints. And oftentimes that struggle of carrying that cross of same-sex attraction, of homosexuality, can itself be, when it's carried generously, can be a beautiful kind of vehicle towards that holiness. Having said that, those men are not called to be priests, right? When we're talking about a deep-seated same-sex attraction, the church has said this over and over and over again. Most recently by Pope Francis in his 2016 Ratio Fundamentalis, which is really the beginning of kind of the next sort of iteration of these documents talking about how to do seminary formation. And we don't want to maybe get to waylaid on all the reasons why and wherefore, but I would say this fundamentally, that if a priest is primarily a spiritual father, that the well-ordered desire for a wife and children is an indispensable precondition for God taking that healthy desire and raising it to a supernatural level and saying that you're going to employ those same desires, and you're going to do so for my family. You're going to be a husband to my church, and you're going to be a father to my own children, right? And that understanding of giving oneself in that way, I think, has to be well-rooted. The speculation as to how we got into the mess we're in, because without a doubt, the numbers are very, very clear that the sexual abuse crisis has been primarily one not of a small child abuse, but of young men. That's just there, right? And no one can argue with those numbers. And so while obviously I'm sure that the vast majority of men who have been ordained with same-sex attraction have never done anything bad like that and have been very faithful, it does not work conversely, right? The vast majority of the abuse has been done by individuals. With this, I believe that there are particular struggles and challenges. I think the evil one takes advantage of that particular struggle in this way to kind of get them off course, and that can happen more easily. I think it's not fair, certainly to the people of God. It's not fair to the man himself, I think, to admit someone with deep-seated same-sex attraction or to ordain him, to the priesthood. And I think we've seen the devastating legacy of that, and the fact that it is still sometimes being touted as an important qualification, that there are certain gifts that men with this struggle have, that we need to be ordaining them. It obviously enrages me, because like, how many young men have to be hurt, before we listen to the church and what she said about the need for making sure that we have men with healthy sexual drives to be ordained, because it's not about it's for the people of God. That the priesthood doesn't exist for me. The priesthood exists for the people that I'm called to serve, and I'm called to do that as a spiritual father. So yeah, I think it's a great question. It's an important point. There's obviously way more to it than that, but I think that might just be sort of the contours. The rest you have to read in the book. Sure.
One more brief question. Deirdre. You are.
I don't know if it's a brief question, could have a much longer answer. Maybe it's worthy of a book. But it seems to me that so seldom, if at all, do we hear about the theology of the church informing this conversation, our ecclesiology, and that the church is, as the body of Christ, shares in his two natures, human and divine, right? Lumen Gentium speaks beautifully of this. And in the church's divinity, she is pure, beautiful, perfect even. And in her humanity, our human nature is fallen, unlike Christ's. So, and in that human nature is always in need of renewal. So I don't mean to lecture, but just to set it out, how does that dual understanding, this mystery of the church, shape your understanding of what we've been going through? Thank you.
Well, Lumen Gentium refers to the church as semper purificanda, always needing to be purified. And the history of the church bears that out. Mystici Corporis, Pius XII's encyclical on the church preceding Lumen Gentium, which is sort of the backdrop for Lumen Gentium, Pius XII has a powerful section talking about particularly the ministers, the failed ministers of the church, and when we encounter them, what are we encountering? But the church in her fallen human nature, right, laboring. And Robert Hugh Benson has a great book, Christ in the Church, and it is this fundamental principle that the church is reproducing the life of Christ on earth. And so everything that we see in the life of Christ, we should expect to see in the church as well. And so we see our Lord in his passion, suffering in his human nature. And when we encounter scandals in the church, that is the mystical body of Christ, again, suffering in human nature and suffering the infliction of sinners upon the body of Christ. And so this is the supernatural outlook, I think, that Father Griffin and others have touched on already, is that we have to have that supernatural view of the church, understanding the church as the body of Christ and suffering through human weakness and through sin, as our Lord did in his passion. And that also, I think, provides an answer to our response. Because when we see our Lord in his passion carrying the cross, and our instinct should be to run to him and to console him and to help him. And so also we see the church, in her passion, reproducing reliving that, and because of the sins of her own ministers, our instinct should be to run to her and to console her and to assist her.
I think we will leave it there. Thank you very much to all of you for coming out. Thanks to all of you who joined us online. Please visit thecatholicproject.org to find out more about the work that we're doing and to find out about future events as they come along. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panelists, and have a good evening.